The morning sun spilled through the high windows of the county courthouse, cutting long rectangles of light across the scuffed wooden floor. The air smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and impatience. Judge Ronald Pierce sat high behind his bench, robe neatly pressed, gavel resting at an angle beside a half-empty mug. He was in his 60s, silver hair carefully parted, his expression carved from stone. Pierce had been on the bench for nearly 3 decades, and in his mind, that made him the ultimate authority in the room, not just on the law, but on the people who passed through it. He scanned the docket for the morning, tapping his pen rhythmically against the page. Traffic violations, he muttered. Speeding, expired tags, reckless driving, another Monday parade. His clerk, a young woman named Evelyn, handed him the next file. Carter, Darnell, she said. Speeding and failure to yield. Pierce barely nodded. Send him up. The courtroom door creaked open, and a tall man in a crisp navy suit stepped forward. His posture was straight, his movements deliberate. He carried a slim leather briefcase and an air of quiet confidence. Darnell Carter looked more like a professor than a defendant. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but clear. Good morning, Your Honor. Pierce didn't look up. You're here for citation number 41189, speeding and failure to yield at the intersection of Maple and 3rd. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Darnell replied, clasping his hands in front of him. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Pierce finally looked up, his eyes narrowing just slightly. A misunderstanding. He flipped through the pages of the citation. According to the officer, you were traveling 15 miles over the limit and ignored a stop sign. That's incorrect, sir, Darnell said evenly. I stopped at the sign. There was another black sedan beside me, same make and model. I believe the officer. Pierce cut him off with a curt laugh. I've heard this one before. Blame the other guy, claim mistaken identity, point fingers. Same story, different face. Evelyn's pen paused mid-scratch on the docket sheet. She glanced up briefly, sensing the shift in tone. With all due respect, Your Honor, Darnell said, maintaining composure, I have dashcam footage that shows. Pierce raised a hand, his expression impatient. Mr. Carter, let me stop you right there. I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's trying to talk circles around the truth. You people, he caught himself but didn't stop quickly enough, always have some excuse ready. The silence that followed stretched thin. One of the defendants waiting at the back of the room shifted in his seat. A woman near the door lowered her eyes. Darnell didn't react, not visibly. He stood motionless, his gaze steady. You people, he repeated quietly. Pierce leaned back in his chair, shrugging. I mean the kind who think the rules don't apply to them. Now, I don't have time for games. You were cited. Pay the fine or take it up with the county appeals office. He scribbled something on the form and set it aside. $500. Next case. Darnell remained where he was, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He simply looked at the judge, really looked at him, with a calmness that made the air feel heavier somehow. Your Honor, he said, his tone measured, I understand the court is busy, but I think it's only fair to review the evidence before making a judgment. Pierce's gavel came down sharply. I said next case, Mr. Carter. We're done here. For a long moment, Darnell didn't move. The courtroom's fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. The hum of the ceiling fan seemed louder than usual. Then, slowly, he nodded and reached down to open his briefcase. Papers rustled quietly as he withdrew a small folder. Understood, he said calmly. May I approach the bench for just a moment, Your Honor? Pierce sighed, exasperated. You're not an attorney, son. You don't just. But Darnell was already stepping forward, each motion deliberate, composed. There was no arrogance, no defiance, only an unsettling steadiness. He stopped just short of the bench and handed a small card to Evelyn, who looked uncertain but passed it up to the judge. Pierce took it with a frown, glancing down at the text embossed in gold. His lips moved slightly as he read the title, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Federal District of Eastern Virginia, Darnell J. Carter. His eyes flicked back up to the man standing before him. Darnell's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze made Pierce's throat dry. The judge shifted in his chair, the earlier confidence draining from his posture. But Darnell didn't say a word, not yet. He simply stood there, silent, the weight of professionalism wrapped around him like armor, waiting for the judge to realize the mistake that had already been made. The quiet in the courtroom was absolute, like the moment before a storm breaks. The silence in the courtroom lingered long after Judge Pierce read the words printed on the card. The gold lettering shimmered faintly under the overhead lights, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Federal District of Eastern Virginia. For a man who thrived on control, the judge suddenly felt it slipping like sand through his fingers. His hand twitched as he placed the card on the desk, as though it burned to the touch. Darnell Carter stood motionless a few feet away, still composed, his gaze steady but not confrontational. He wasn't smiling, wasn't gloating, he was simply there, exuding a quiet authority that no robe or gavel could surpass. "Mr. Carter," the judge finally said, his voice faltering on the name. "You're a federal prosecutor." "Yes, Your Honor," Darnell replied evenly. "I handle criminal cases out of the Eastern District Office. Mostly fraud, sometimes public corruption. I was here today because my traffic citation notice instructed me to appear before this court." The words public corruption seemed to hang in the air a little longer than the rest. Pierce swallowed hard. His knuckles whitened where they gripped the bench. "I see," he said, his tone quieter now, the sharpness gone. "Well, this is unusual." Evelyn, the clerk, was frozen at her desk. She'd seen Judge Pierce bark at dozens of defendants over the years, people who couldn't afford attorneys, people who didn't know how to speak in the clipped, practiced tone that the judge respected. But she'd never seen him stumble, never seen the color drain from his face like this. "I didn't mean," Pierce began, the words awkward and heavy. "I wasn't aware," Darnell interrupted, but his voice was calm, almost kind. "You weren't aware of my position, no. But that shouldn't matter, should it?" Pierce blinked. The question sliced through the room like a scalpel, not shouted, not accusatory, but sharp enough to sting. "Justice," Darnell continued, "is supposed to be blind to status, background, and appearance. At least that's what I was taught in law school." The judge looked down at the citation, then back up at him. The gavel, which had struck the desk with such force minutes earlier, now sat untouched. "You have evidence?" Pierce asked. "I do," Darnell said, opening his briefcase again. He withdrew a small tablet and tapped the screen. "This is dashcam footage from my vehicle. You'll see that I stopped fully at the intersection of Maple and 3rd. The officer's car was positioned on the opposite corner. His view was partially obstructed by a delivery truck." Evelyn leaned forward slightly, curious. Darnell extended the tablet toward her, and she hesitated only a second before accepting it. The video played in silence, the still image of a suburban street, a stop sign, Darnell's car halting cleanly before proceeding. The timestamp matched the citation. Pierce stared at the screen for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. "Looks legitimate." His voice was barely above a murmur. "I assure you, it is," Darnell replied. "And I would have been glad to show it earlier if I'd been allowed to finish speaking." The statement wasn't angry, but it carried a subtle power, a reminder that the courtroom floor wasn't just his stage. Pierce shifted in his chair, suddenly aware of the people watching, the other defendants, the clerk, even the bailiff standing still by the door. He cleared his throat. "It appears there may have been a misunderstanding." "Understandable," Darnell said softly. "Mistakes happen. But I do think words matter, Your Honor. Especially in this room." The judge's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being corrected, especially not in public. But there was no malice in Darnell's tone, only a quiet insistence on accountability. The kind that couldn't be brushed aside with arrogance. "Mr. Carter," Pierce said after a long pause, "I'll dismiss the citation. Clearly, there's no basis for it." "Thank you," Darnell said. "That's appreciated." He gathered his papers slowly, methodically, as if giving the judge a moment to absorb what had just happened. But as he closed his briefcase, he added in that same measured tone, "For the record, I'll still be filing a report with the State Judicial Commission. My position requires me to document instances where court conduct raises ethical concerns. I'm sure you understand." The color that had momentarily returned to Pierce's face drained away again. Evelyn's eyes flicked to the judge. She could almost hear the thought screaming behind his tight expression, "This man could ruin me." "I see," Pierce said, his voice barely a whisper. Darnell nodded once. "This isn't personal, Your Honor. It's procedural. I've sat in too many courtrooms where people didn't have the power to speak up when they were dismissed, or mocked, or silenced. I just want to make sure no one else experiences that here." Pierce looked at him. Really looked this time. Gone was the impatient defendant he'd written off minutes earlier. Standing before him was a man who commanded respect without demanding it, whose restraint was more powerful than anger. The judge exhaled slowly. "I understand." "Good," Darnell said quietly. "Then we're done here." He nodded politely to the clerk, thanked the bailiff, and turned to leave. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the courtroom, each one a reminder of the moment that power had shifted, quietly, irreversibly. As the door closed behind him, Pierce sat back in his chair. His hands trembled slightly. For the first time in his long, comfortable career, he wondered how many others had walked out of that same courtroom, unheard, unseen, unfairly judged, and what they must have thought of him as they left. The gavel sat untouched beside him, heavy with meaning. For once, he didn't reach for it. Outside, the morning air was crisp, and the faint hum of city traffic filled the space that the courtroom's silence had left behind. Darnell Carter stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the echo of his polished shoes against the stone sharp and steady. He paused for a moment at the top, breathing in deeply. It wasn't satisfaction he felt, not triumph, not even relief. It was something quieter, more grounded. He'd done what needed to be done. Nothing more, nothing less. He glanced down at his watch. 9:47 a.m. The entire hearing had lasted less than 30 minutes, but it had revealed far more than most trials ever did. He opened his briefcase, tucked away his documents, and started walking toward the parking lot. The courthouse doors creaked open behind him, and he could feel eyes on his back. Some from curiosity, some from respect, and maybe one or two from disbelief. It didn't matter. He'd made his point without ever raising his voice. Inside, Judge Ronald Pierce sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the empty space Darnell had left behind. The room, once so familiar and comfortably predictable, now felt foreign. The same wooden bench, the same gavel, the same clerk, but the air was different. He ran a hand down his face, feeling the weight of his own words pressing on him like a physical ache. "You people always have excuses." The phrase replayed in his mind, looping mercilessly, each repetition heavier than the last. Evelyn, his clerk, sat quietly at her desk, pretending to organize files. She didn't look up, didn't say anything. But the silence between them was full of things unsaid. Pierce could feel the judgment in it, not cruel, not gleeful, but simply honest. It was the same quiet honesty Darnell had carried when he stood before him, and it was unbearable. Finally, Pierce broke the silence. "He's going to file a report." Evelyn hesitated. "Yes, sir." He said he would. He nodded slowly. "Of course he will." He looked at his own hands, the same hands that had wielded authority for decades. For years, he'd prided himself on being tough but fair. At least, that's what he told himself. But in that moment, the phrase rang hollow. How many times had he dismissed someone because of how they looked, how they spoke, how they dressed? How many times had he assumed guilt before hearing truth? He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the tile. "That's enough for today," he muttered. "Adjourn the rest to the morning docket. Reschedule them for next week." Evelyn blinked in surprise. "All of them?" "Yes." His voice was distant. "All of them." When he stepped into his chambers, the door clicked shut behind him with a dull finality. The room smelled faintly of old paper and stale coffee, the scent of his routine. He sank into the leather chair behind his desk and stared at the framed degrees on the wall. Harvard Law, State Bar Certification, commendations for excellence in service. Each plaque gleamed under the soft light, but none of them felt earned anymore. For the first time, he questioned what kind of service he had really given. Meanwhile, across the city, Darnell sat in a quiet cafe, his laptop open, fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. He wasn't angry. Anger was easy. It faded fast. He preferred precision. Facts, dates, quotes. Every detail of the hearing went into his report. The judge's interruptions, the dismissive tone, the slur that hung heavy in the air. He wrote objectively, professionally, without embellishment. Still, As he typed, his thoughts drifted to the people who hadn't had a badge or title to protect them. The ones who walked into that courtroom and left humiliated, unheard, without a second chance. That thought stayed with him longer than the incident itself. His phone buzzed beside him, an email notification. From Evelyn L. The subject line read, "Apology from Judge Pierce." He hesitated for a moment before opening it. The message was short, "Greater than Mr. Carter. Judge Pierce asked me to forward his personal apology for his conduct in court today. He acknowledges his comments were inappropriate and unprofessional. He has requested a meeting with you, should you wish to discuss the matter further. Respectfully, Evelyn Lewis, Court Clerk." Darnell stared at the screen for a few seconds, then sighed softly. He closed the laptop without replying. Some apologies didn't need words. They needed change. Back in the courthouse, Pierce sat alone, his desk covered in untouched papers. The noise of the building carried faintly through the door, shuffling feet, muffled conversations, the rustle of movement. But in his chambers, there was stillness. He picked up the small business card Darnell had left behind, turning it over in his hand. Assistant U.S. Attorney, Federal District of Eastern Virginia. The title should have been intimidating, but what haunted him wasn't the power behind it, it was the grace with which Darnell had used it. No anger, no arrogance, no threat. Just dignity. And in that dignity was something far stronger than authority, integrity. Pierce set the card down carefully, almost reverently. For the first time in his long career, he realized that justice wasn't about commanding respect, it was about deserving it. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, spilling light through the courthouse windows. Dust motes danced in the beams, silent and slow. And somewhere across town, a federal prosecutor closed his briefcase, stepped into the day, and hoped, quietly, sincerely, that maybe one courtroom would be a little fairer the next time someone like him walked in.